All right. Anyways, though, so the point that I'm making here, though, is that in 1 Corinthians, there was a very different set of people than what we were looking at in Romans. The big reason for this, as I started to mention, is that Corinth was a very diverse city. It sat in the middle of two parts of the sea, and there was a huge shipping lane that was running between a city called Troas and Rome. And dead in the middle of all of that is Corinth. And the reason why Corinth became extremely important to trade and commerce was because there was a very rough section of the sea up in the north. So the ships would come down to the south, and Corinth was on this thing called an isthmus of land. It was just a little chunk that separated the two parts of the ocean. They could go over the long way over the sea, and they could have extreme difficulty and have to worry about sinking ships and things like that in the north, or they could go over this little isthmus of land and get put on the other side. The thing that made Corinth extremely impressive in their day was that they actually figured out a way to take the ships over land right there. They had this impressive setup with rails and all this, and it ran something over a mile long, and they actually picked the ships up out of the water and moved them back then. Very impressive, really, for the times. Yeah. And so you have an extreme melting pot of people from all over the empire, and like I've mentioned before, Rome was a very small force compared to the amount of land that they came to occupy in biblical times here. Rome and the native Romans were maybe 20% at best of the people that were the Roman Empire at this point. And all the rest of these peoples were largely actually slaves from the former empire, or the Greek Empire. They were the descendants of them and the governments that were overthrown along the way, because there was many countries that were overthrown and taken. The Greeks took so much, and then the Romans came through and took even more, and they occupied even more land space. And when you do that and you're spread that thin, the cultures, they don't just go away. And the large prevailing culture that survived all of that was the Greek culture, because the Greek occupiers, they had a few hundred years to settle in. So the Greek culture actually ran through almost the entire empire, whereas the Roman culture was only really there for the upper class. Like we saw in the end of Romans, there was lots of people that had a Roman name, but the fact is that maybe no more than a third of them at best were probably Romans as they were being named out there. They were just using a name because they were in Rome. Let's see, further history on this. So what do you think happens when you have a major shipping lane through a city, and you have all these merchants, all these traveling sailors?
Chaos.
Debauchery. There's the word we're looking for. And I was going to see if anybody was going to make that easier for me. So thank you, Roger, for leading the way on that one. There was this temple to Aphrodite. And it's really debatable whether this was, as bad now at this point in time in biblical times as it had been a couple hundred years before, because Corinth got laid waste to. The city got absolutely just about burnt to the ground, and then 100 and some years later comes in the Romans, and they rebuild on it because of the need for this strategic location. And the city had flourished back to 500 and some thousand people. It was bigger than it had been before, population-wise, though it took up a much smaller area. So you had a very dense population in a small area. It was like being in New York City now, but the difference is it was, because the world, a lot less people in the world, right? But there was so much debauchery that this city was the Las Vegas of its time. It was. This town was bad. And the different major cities in the empire, they had different though there would be temples to multiples of the Roman gods and the Greek gods throughout all of those cities, there was always a couple that ended up being the main attraction in those cities. And for Corinth, the main attraction was the temple to Aphrodite. And that, obviously, the goddess of love and just plain sex, really. So, and the history that comes into account there, and this is debatable because they have uncovered some more ruins, and basically they see that there was a much smaller temple in biblical times to Aphrodite than what there had been a couple hundred years before. But there was a lot of writing in outside sources from the Bible that claim that there was some 1,000 temple prostitutes. And it was actually part of their religion to buy and engage with prostitutes for the worshipers of Aphrodite. This might even sound kind of crazy, but there was actually a lot of evidence of a whole lot of people having died of syphilis in that city. So we're talking real debauchery here. And that's the culture that Corinthians takes place in. And then you have, let's just say, like, we see those bumper stickers here in town, and they say, "Keep Missoula weird." And we've got a whole lot of people from a whole lot of places here, and then we have some very liberal orientations going on. And pretty soon, I mean, if any of you have really gotten around and talked to the weirder side of Missoula, you know there's a whole lot of confusion going on when it comes to ideas about God and about, other things. I mean, some places you can go and people are just straight up atheists. Here, there's enough confusion that you might actually more often hear ideas like, "Oh, there's so many ways to God." Hey, everybody can get there somehow. One of those that's just completely, it's nonsense. When you actually hold it up to any kind of a, what's the word?
Truth?
Yeah, well, when you try to actually hold it up even to just solid reasoning. And that's something that happens when you have a melting pot of cultures. Because people are all coexisting together, and you have so many different views on what is and what is not, and people want to be somewhat accepting of each other, and pretty soon you end up with a whole lot of questions and a whole lot of acceptance of things that go against people's own reasoning in the name of coexisting. Tolerance, perfect idea, right? I mean, look at how they've pushed tolerance in our culture. The word itself doesn't mean anything like what they've made it mean. Tolerance is letting people exist together. Absolute acceptance, blind acceptance is what they've turned the word's meaning into. And that's what happens when you have that kind of a melting pot. This is what we're dealing with then. This is Missoula, this is Las Vegas, this is New York, this is a mix of all of those things culturally. This is the kind of a city this was, and in ancient times, I mean, that's impressive. Because we like to think that we've done it better so far as our debauchery, I think, but we might find out that's not the case in this book. Go ahead, Wanda.
Doesn't this lead into also the revised Roman, revised Greek kingdom at the end of time? Lead into Revelation and Daniel, the revised.
That's a whole very large issue to try to get into.
Okay.
That's way hard to get into something like that.
Okay.
I mean, I think I know where you're going with that, but man, that's a big talk right there.
Okay, we won't go there.
And the introduction here, in my Bible, the purpose. It says Paul had two primary reasons in mind as he penned this letter: to correct the serious problems in the Corinthian church that had been reported to him. These were disordered, that the Corinthians viewed lightly, but that Paul regarded as serious sin. To provide counsel and instruction in the verity of questions about which the Corinthians had written. these included both issues of doctrine and personal and corporate conduct of purity.
I am definitely going in that same direction. The difference between the way that one worded it, though, and the thing that I consider to be a major issue, though, is that well, like it said in there, first off, the place where it does come together is that because of that cultural melting pot and that acceptance thing that ends up happening when you push that many different people together, that bleeds into the church if we let it. If we let a culture that is directly opposed to God, become a part of our lives instead of remaining separate, as we're called to be, then instead of the church affecting the world affects the church. And that's what was happening in Paul's time with the Corinthians. See, in I forget what chapter it is, something like 16, 17 of Acts, it talks about when Paul went to Corinth and he first tried to take the gospel to the Jews there, and he was just getting doors shut in his face, so he felt the Spirit leading him, no, I called you to the Gentiles, go to the Gentiles. And so he ends up spending a year there with this church flourishing. And so even though this church ended up having some mix of Jews in it as well, obviously, but the difference is that in this church was mostly Gentile. And it was mostly taken with a Greek culture, a very Greek culture, a very confused Greek culture. And so though they had spiritual gifts, Paul found he had to correct them on how they use them, and that they ought to be there to edify one another and to build up the church. And though they believed, they had struggles with what is really right and wrong, and what can they carry in from their culture into the church, and the answer is not much. No. But they needed to be told that, because he spent some time with them, but then he leaves, and like always, other people come in and they've got ideas, or their own, someone in the church becomes persuasive, and it gets really easy for culture to affect the church, the world's culture. And that's what happened in Corinthians. He went off and he was in Ephesus some year after that later, and first a group of people came to him giving him news that they had problems over, eating meats from the temples, what can we eat and not, like we had in 14 or something back in Romans, if that was the right chapter. Was that 14? Okay. So we have that issue, but under a slightly different context. We have sexual stuff, sexual idolatry stuff. We have, let me see here. There is one little piece here that I ought to just read you directly. Mine lays out the key themes as very differently, so I'm going to do that too. But there we go. Yeah, it says as the main theme, it says 1 Corinthians covers a number of topics. One theme emerges from these discussions, however, as Paul's dominant concern. Paul wants this church, divided because of the arrogance of its more powerful members, to work together for the advancement of the gospel. He wants them to drop their divisive one-upmanship, build up the faith of those who are weak, and witness effectively to unbelievers. See, if you're in the middle of this huge shipping lane, Paul, being the missionary that he is, he takes Corinth pretty seriously, because if you convert one person from a foreign country while he's in town, he's taking that back home with him. Right. And so the potential for evangelism that could arise out of Corinth more than anywhere really is limitless in Paul's mind. What is the Spirit going to do next? And when you see the picture of what happens in Acts, they were seeing the Spirit moving. They really were in their time. And so this was a big deal to him. And like I said, with this being a Greek culture, there were some things about Greek culture that might not be so readily apparent unless you're let in on it. But one of them is social classes. It was a big deal to them. If you, even as you remember with Jesus, he talked about seating someone first. If the rich man comes in, don't push him to the front of the line and seat him first. If someone else is there, first give them the good seat. Show the poor man the honor. Do that stuff, and that was something that in Greek culture was a big issue. And for the church, it was poisonous because the members cannot be thinking of themselves as being better than the other members. It goes directly against grace, and it goes directly against what we know of God, of God's view of our righteousness. There is none. Our righteousness is as rags, right? So that's a problem if we think that we're better than each other by how much we make or our social status outside of church or anything like that, because we will be turning our eyes away from the truth of grace and unable to live in grace. And in that church, though, in this letter, there's multiple occasions that are going to come out where we see little indications that there was this big division in this church over class. And the biggest one, of course, was the one with the community meals that they had, where the people that were of means, they got to go through the line first, eat first, and then they'd stuff themselves and leave nothing for the poor people that were their brothers and sisters. I mean, that was really this stuff's really in there. They were really behaving in this kind of way. And so Paul, in a very unlike way to his tone in Romans, he becomes very corrective on these matters. He's not just being very gentle and in between the lines and, always so gently building people up before he gives them a correction. Sometimes he's kind of harsh in this, because this is important to him, and he needs to see this church change its way, because the forward movement of the gospel out of this very strategically important city that was, it was strategically important for, the movement of goods being shipped, and for Paul it was the same thing. He saw the gospel possibly moving out of Corinth in a way that couldn't be matched almost anywhere. And you can tell that because he's emotional in this letter. He really is. It's a very different tone than Romans, and I'm hoping that all of you guys will see that as we go forward. I'm trying to kind of simplify all of this, but I am going to just read in closing what mine lays out as being the key themes for this book. 1, since the church is the dwelling place of God's Spirit, the people who make up the church should work for unity by building each other up. 2, Christians should build up the church in 4 practical ways. A, they should be sensitive to those of fragile faith. B, they should win unbelievers through culturally sensitive evangelism. C, they should conduct worship services in such a way that unbelievers present might come to faith. And D, their corporate worship should use spiritual gifts not for personal display or evaluating who has a better gift, but to build up the church. 3, sexual relations form a union between man and woman as profound as the union of the believer with Christ, and so sexual activity should be confined to marriage. 4, baptism and the Lord's Supper are important, but both are subordinate to personal trust in the gospel and to living in the way that God commands. And 5, the bodily resurrection of Jesus and of his followers from the dead is a critical component of Christian faith and practice. So anyways, were there any further questions? Oh, it is. I love Corinthians. Corinthians is awesome. But
The one thing that I keep, and this might be a rabbit trail, I hope not, but in the day that this was written, Rome really was over all of that known world, including Corinth, correct?
yes.
Okay, so the distinction between Greek and Jew, Gentile and Jew, if you will, is still underneath the Roman banner. I mean, all the way to Jerusalem, it was all under Roman control.
Yeah.
You look at a map from Rome to Jerusalem, it's an enormous amount of distance.
Yeah.
And Corinth is right about in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So Rome, under all of this land and And so there we see the reason for the opposition throughout that 70 years of the new church age from Rome,
Mhm.
is that they really are the big daddy. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that, make sure that,
Oh, yeah.
I understood correctly that Rome still was under, or had the control over everything.
Oh, they did, yeah.
Corinth they weren't autonomous, they weren't escaping Roman rule.
Oh no, they were not. They were definitely that city had been reestablished by Rome purposefully for the merchants.
And so the
and for
things
moving
that
the
went
goods.
on in Corinth were allowed by Rome, that's what I.
Oh, they were. Yeah, this was the Greek and Roman culture that pervades here. It's strong, and
Yeah.
especially the Greek side though in Corinth. And really though, as far as the Jews go, there was the farther towards Rome you got, the less Jews there were living in the area because their religion actually had them going to Jerusalem a couple, 3 times a year
Yeah,
as the main reason. And plus,
Yeah.
you know, there was the fact was that to most of the Roman Empire, the Jews were a lower class. To the Roman Empire, not necessarily the Greek culture, but to the Roman Empire. And so there was that expulsion from Rome that came not too long after all of this and things like that. And I mean, it shows just what the tone was toward them in general. It wasn't a good one. So the Christians, as such, were also considered to be just under the Jews. They were kind of under the main people's, view. They were probably really just kind of a weird offshoot of the Jews. Is about all they were thinking of them as then. So this city, though, in general, there weren't many Jews around. There really weren't. This was because they were considered a lower class people, and this became a merchants trading city. And almost everybody actually did their business in Roman. I mean, most of the writings that survived from Corinth were actually in Roman or in Latin. And the main trade language of the empire, as we know, and for this being the reason why the Bible was written in Koine Greek, is more of a common language in the Koine. So the fact that almost everything that survives of all of these business transactions, everything that's written down that's been recovered, the fact that it's almost all in Latin says that this was a very upper class city to begin with. And there was a lot of money in that. If you owned a ship and you were a merchant back then, you had the money. And that's no joke. That's not like having a good trade like Paul. It was considered somewhat of an upper class trade. Those people were considered rich. And that's the core. There's a certain amount of pride that goes with that. And there's a Greek culture that sets itself largely on social classes. And all of that stuff is part of the culture that ends up causing a very huge division within the Corinthian church. And that's what he's getting into here.
was a letter to Corinth written before Romans?
I can't remember. They were within a year of each other either way, though.
Yeah.
If I remember right, Corinthians was first. First Corinthians. But either way, they were within about a year of each other. And
If that's true.
this one was written from Ephesus, though.
To consider the leapfrog that Paul made from Corinth to Rome. That was.
Oh, he didn't go to Rome. He was writing Rome from... I think he was actually writing Rome from Corinth.
But he was intending to. I mean, his decision to go to Rome was set.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's what he proclaimed,
Mm-hmm.
But what a huge decision that was. Just for him to say that this is what my role. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely, man.
The Greek culture is kind of the same way right now, isn't it? Like the males are way above the females. At least the ones I know.
The ones
from
I've
here
noticed,
in Missoula.
yeah, the ones that I've noticed, they do have kind of a culture like that. But I don't know if that was. I honestly can't tell you if that was something that carried through when thousands of years go by.
No, I mean now. Is that?
Yeah, that
I
is
think
true.
it's
Now
the
I've
way
seen
the
that.
Greek
Yeah.
are.
That's just the way their people are. Yeah, but
So they really haven't changed much.
well, that doesn't mean that hasn't went back and forth 4 times in the meantime. I'm not an expert on Greek culture, honestly. I don't know. I know some stuff from their time, and I know a little bit that I've seen in our time with their culture, and not much. But that's because I like Greek food, so end of discussion on that. Anyways, so hey, Roger, could you lead us out in prayer, brother?
the other, one day at a time, and yet, Lord, it is for eternities. Thank you, Lord, that we can read about our predecessors in the Christian faith and have faith